Winter was descending on Saint-Aubin-sur-Limignon with unusual ferocity. Icy winds swept the slate roofs of the houses scattered throughout this remote valley, and snow already covered the muddy paths that connected the small village to the rest of the world. In this isolated region, where news from Paris took weeks to arrive, life flowed to the rhythm of the seasons and the church bells. The parish of Sainte Marie dominated the village with its Gothic silhouette, its gray stones seeming to absorb the winter light. This is where brothers Jean-Luc and Matthias Rouvière officiated, two men whom the locals venerated like living saints. Jean-Luc, the eldest at 42, was a tall, thin man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to scrutinize souls. His deep voice resonated in the nave with a divine authority that brooked no dispute. Matthias, 5 years younger, contrasted with his brother with his good-natured build and warm smile that immediately inspired confidence. The two men had arrived in Saint-Aubin 15 years earlier, bearing a letter of recommendation from the bishopric of Mende. They had quickly won the hearts of the villagers with their exemplary devotion and apparent generosity. Jean-Luc led the services with a mystical fervor that electrified the congregation, while Matthias worked on charitable works welcoming the needy and lost travelers. That morning, Marie Bonifoy, the village baker, climbed the snowy path leading to the presby, carrying a basket of fresh bread under her arm. At 60, this robust woman, her eyes reddened by the cold, was one of the pillars of the parish community. She knocked on the heavy chain door, adorned with a wrought iron knocker. "Good morning, Father Matthias," she said when the priest opened his face, lighting up with his usual smile. "Marie, my dear child." Matthias replied in his gentle voice, "Come in and warm yourself." Jean-Luc finished his morning prayers. The interior of the presbytery exuded piety and austerity. The stone walls were adorned with crucifixes and holy images, while a fire crackled in the hearth of the large fireplace. Marie placed her basket on the massive kitchen table and gladly accepted the cup of hot herbal tea the priest offered her. "Are the roads still impassable?" Matthias asked, sitting down opposite her. "Alas, yes, Father. The postman from Marvejols hasn't been able to come for 8 days. But don't worry, we have everything we need in the village to get through the winter." Heavy footsteps echoed on Pierre's staircase, and Jean-Luc appeared, dressed in his impeccable black cassock. His gaze fell on Marie with the intensity that always made her uncomfortable. "Marie," he said simply, inclining his head. "How are your children?" "Father, thank God. Pierre still works at the blacksmith's and my little Jean helps her mother at the inn, Catherine Blanc's inn, without whom Matthias is suddenly more attentive. Yes, Father, she's been having a hard time since her husband left to work on the railway. With all these travelers stopping by, she can't cope anymore." The two brothers exchanged a quick glance that Marie didn't notice, busy as she was drinking her herbal tea. "Travelers," Jean-Luc continued, his voice betraying a sudden interest. "At this time of year, oh, you know, Father, there are always a few. Last week, a peddler from Lyon stopped for 3 days, a man alone with no family, selling ribbons and lace. And the day before yesterday, it was a young man on his way to Toulouse to look for work. He didn't have a penny in his pocket, poor thing." "Bourne, is he staying?" Matthias asked, his tone strangely sweet. "Catherine does what she can, but her rooms are small and poorly heated. She often sends them to the presbytery to ask for help." Jean-Luc stood up abruptly, startling Marie. "I must go prepare tonight's service," he declared. Before disappearing into the depths of the house, Matthias accompanied Marie to the door, bestowing her with his most benevolent smile. "Don't hesitate to send these poor people to us, Marie. Our Christian duty is to welcome them. We always have a bowl of hot soup and a warm bed for those who need it." "You are true saints, Father," replied the baker, adjusting her shawl. "God will reward you in full." Once the door closed, Matthias joined his brother in the wine cellar adjoining the kitchen. The place was plunged into a cold gloom, lit only by a few candles that cast dancing shadows on the damp walls. Quarters of meat hung from hooks attached to the ceiling beams, giving off a peculiar Swedish odor. "You have heard," whispered Jean-Luc, his eyes shining with a strange glow in the semi-darkness. "The young man without family who is going to Toulouse," agreed Matthias. "He must still be at the inn. It's a sign." "Of Providence, brother. Another lost lamb who has come to offer himself to our sacred mission." Matthias shook his head, but a shadow of doubt crossed his round face. "Jean-Luc, sometimes I wonder if—" "If what?" interrupted the elder, his voice hissing like a blade. "Reen forgets," corrected Matthias. "When? Tonight after Vespers, go see him at the inn. Tell him we've heard about his situation and that we wish to help him. Offer him a hot meal and a bed for the night. And if he refuses," Jean-Luc smiles, "but there's nothing kind about it. He won't refuse. He never refuses." Evening was falling quickly on Saint-Alban, enveloping the village in a blanket of darkness that the few lights in the windows only managed to pierce timidly. Matthias left the presbytery after the service, his figure wrapped in a thick black cloak, heading towards the village inn. Catherine Blanc's establishment was modest, a two-story house with a carved wooden sign that creaked in the wind. Inside, the common room was bathed in a smoky atmosphere, mingling with the smells of stew and sour wine. A few village regulars were seated around the fire, discussing local news in hushed voices. At the back of the room, near a window on a foggy window, a young man in his 20s sat alone, in front of a nearly empty bowl of soup. His worn and patched clothes belied his modest circumstances, and his thin face bore the marks of travel fatigue. His name was Anton Dubois, and he came from a small village near Clermont-Ferrand. Orphaned since the age of 15, he had worked as a farm laborer until mechanization deprived him of his job. Matthias approached his table with his most welcoming smile. "Good evening, my son," he said, bowing slightly. "I am Father Matthias of the parish of Saint Marie. I understand you are going through a difficult time." Anton looked up, surprised that a priest was addressing him. He stood up hastily, almost knocking over his chair. "My father, I—" "Yes, that is, sit down, my son, sit down." Matthias soothed, taking a seat opposite him. "Catherine told me about your situation. Are you going to Toulouse?" "Yes, father. I was told there was work in the new factories. I have nothing at home since machines replaced workers. It's a long way to Toulouse, especially in winter, and dangerous for a man alone." Anton nodded sadly, stirring the last drops of soup in his bowl. "I still have a few pennies, but with this snow, listen." Matthias interrupted, leaning towards him. "My brother and I run the parish in this village. Our mission is to help the needy. How would you like to spend the night at the presbytery? We have a heated room and we could prepare a good meal for you." Anton's eyes lit up. "My father is very generous, but I wouldn't want to take advantage of him. Come on. It's our Christian duty. And then tomorrow morning we can give you some supplies for the road and perhaps even a letter of recommendation for the priests in Toulouse." Anton couldn't believe his ears. After weeks of difficult travel, sleeping in barns or under the stars, this proposal seemed miraculous to him. "I gratefully accept, Father. How can I thank you?" "Your prayers will suffice, my son," Matthias replied, getting up. "Come, let's go join my brother. He will be delighted to meet you." The two men left the inn under the kindly gaze of the villagers. Catherine Blanc herself smiled as she saw them leave, happy that this poor boy was finally finding some comfort. The presbytery seemed even more imposing in the darkness, its lit windows casting golden rectangles of light onto the snow. Matthias pushed open the heavy door and ushered Antlin into the warmth of the hearth. Jean-Luc was waiting for them in the living room, standing by the fireplace. His slender figure stood out against the flames. When he turned to them, Antlin was struck by the intensity of his gaze. "My brother," said Matthias, "I present to you Anton Dubois, the young man Marie told us about." "Anton," repeated Jean-Luc, approaching. "Appropriately, a name that means priceless." He held a firm hand, which Anton shook respectfully. "Father, I don't know how to thank you for your hospitality in serving the Lord as we all do," replied Jean-Luc, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "Matthias, our guest, must be hungry. Why not? Can you prepare something substantial for him?" "Of course," Matthias agreed. "Anton, sit by the fire. You must be in awe." While Matthias busied himself in the kitchen, Jean-Luc questioned Antlin about his trip, his family, his plans. He learned that the young man was truly alone in the world, with no ties or anyone to worry about his fate. This information seemed to satisfy him greatly. "You know, Anton," he said, leaning toward him, "Providence has led you to us. In this isolated valley, we carry out a special mission, a sacred work that sometimes requires sacrifice." Anton nodded politely, not really understanding the priest's point. "We are the guardians of an ancient secret," Jean-Luc continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic tone. "A truth that only the chosen can understand. Perhaps you are one of them." Before Anton could reply, Matthias returned with a tray laden with a steaming plate and a pitcher of wine. "This is what you're catering for," he said, placing everything on a small table near Antlin's armchair. The young man looked at the plate in surprise. The meat, sliced thickly and covered in a brown sauce, had a color and texture he didn't recognize. The aroma wafting from it was rich, almost intoxicating. "What is this?" he asked innocently. The two brothers exchanged a glance. "It's our specialty," Jean-Luc replied. "A family recipe we prepare for special occasions. Taste it, you'll tell me about it." Anton brought a bite to his lips. The meat was incredibly tender and flavorful, with a delicate taste he'd never experienced, an almost sweet flavor that melted on the tongue. "It's delicious," he exclaimed. "What an animal! A very special lamb," murmured Jean-Luc, his eyes shining in the firelight. "A lamb sacrificed according to ancient rites." Anton continued to eat with gusto, not noticing the satisfied smiles the two priests exchanged. The thick, heady wine was beginning to go to his head, and a gentle drowsiness was creeping over him. "I feel strangely tired," he said, yawning. "That's normal after such a long journey," Matthias reassured him. "Finish your meal, then we'll show you to your room." But Anton was already having trouble keeping his eyes open. The plate slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a clatter of broken china. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him. "What? What did you give me?" Is he slurring his tongue? Jean-Luc stood up slowly, his figure seeming to grow in the gathering darkness. "What we give all our special guests, Anton, a taste of eternity." The young man collapsed in his chair, his head falling limply to one side. The drugs mixed with the wine had taken effect. "He's heavier than he looks," Matthias grunted, helping his brother carry the lifeless body. "The flesh will be excellent," Jean-Luc replied with satisfaction. "Young, healthy, naturally nourished, our parishioners will appreciate it." They lowered Anton into the cellars of the presbytery, where others before him had met the same fate. In this damp crypt with its oozing walls, hooks and chains awaited their next use, and in a carefully arranged corner were the tools necessary for their gruesome work. Meanwhile, in the sleepy village, the inhabitants of St. Talbot slept peacefully, convinced they were protected by two holy men devoted to their well-being. They did not yet know that their next communion would be more literal than they could have imagined. 3 weeks had passed since the disappearance. of Antoine Dubois, and the village of Saint-Aubin had returned to its usual winter rhythm. The snow continued to fall intermittently, further isolating the community from the outside world. In this white and silent cocoon, life flowed to the rhythm of bells and prayers punctuated by the parish activities that brought the faithful together daily. This Sunday morning, the Church of Saint Marie resounded with the liturgical chants intoned by the congregation. Jean-Luc officiated from the hotel, his deep voice carrying the sacred words up to the Gothic vaults. In the front rows, the village notables, Mayor Henry Duran, the Dr. Philippe Rousseau, and a few landowners followed the service with devotion. Behind them, families of artisans and farmers crowded onto the wooden benches worn by generations of worshippers. Marie Bonnefoy, true to form, occupied her usual seat in the third row, accompanied by her daughter Jean, a young woman of 22 with pink cheeks and carefully braided chestnut hair. The young woman worked at the Catherine Blanc's family, had been following her father's death the previous year, and her simple beauty was not lost on anyone in the village, including the two Rouvieres brothers. While Jean-Luc continued the Mass, Matthias discreetly observed the congregation from his position near the heart. His gaze lingered on certain faces, assessing, yes, selecting, for that was how their system worked. Matthias spotted potential prey and then used his charisma to lure them into their net. When it was time for communion, the faithful approached the hotel in single file. Jean-Luc distributed the consecrated hosts with particular solemnity, murmuring personalized blessings to each one. But what intrigued some parishioners was the blessed bread Matthias distributed after the service. Slices of a particularly tasty bread that he presented as a specialty of their native region. "This bread has such a special taste," murmured Madame Charpentier, the blacksmith's wife, as she left the church. "There's a sweetness I can't quite identify. It's a family secret that the fathers jealously guard," replied Catherine Blanc. "They told me it requires a special preparation with rare ingredients." Jean Bonnefoy, who had overheard the conversation, timidly approached Matthias, who was putting away his liturgical things. "Father," she said, bowing her head respectfully, "my mother was wondering if you would be willing to share with us the recipe for your blessed bread. She would like to make some for special occasions." Matthias turned his most benevolent smile toward her, but a glimmer flashed in his eyes that the young girl couldn't interpret. "My dear Jean, it's very flattering, but alas, it's a secret my brother and I have sworn never to reveal. It comes to us from our grandmother, who herself inherited it from her own mother, and so on for generations. I understand, Father, forgive my curiosity." "Come on. There's nothing wrong with that," replied Matthias, placing a fatherly hand on the young woman's shoulder. "But tell me, how have you been since your father's death? It can't be easy for you and your mother." Jean lowered her eyes at this sign of attention. "We're managing, Father. My work at the inn helps us, and my mother has her loyal customers at the bakery. And as for marriage, a beautiful young woman like you shouldn't remain single for long." The young woman blushed violently. "There's no one there, Father, and besides, I can't leave my mother alone." "Your devotion does you credit," murmured Matthias. "But you know, sometimes the Lord has surprises in store for us. There might be something new in your life soon." Before Jean could ask what he meant by that, Jean-Luc joined them, his imposing presence interrupting their conversation. "Matthias, we have to prepare for tonight's service," he said, giving his brother a pointed look. "Of course," the latter replied. "Goodbye, Jean. Give my regards to your mother." Once the last parishioners had left, the two brothers found themselves alone in the silent church. Jean-Luc carefully locked the doors before turning to Matthias. "Our supplies are starting to dwindle," he said without preamble, "and the roads will soon be passable again. We'll have to replenish our stocks." Matthias, but his expression betrayed a certain weariness. Travelers are few and far between at this time of year, and then people start asking questions about all these strangers who stop by our place and are never seen again. Exactly, replied Jean-Luc, his eyes shining with a malevolent glint. Perhaps it's time to draw on more local resources. Matthias looked at him in comprehension. You mean there are people in this village whose disappearance wouldn't raise too many questions. Loners, outcasts, people with no close family. Jean-Luc, no, we can't touch the villagers. They're our parishioners. The elder violently grabbed his brother by the collar of his cassock. They're our flock, Matthias, our herd. And what does a shepherd do with his sheep when it's time for a feast? And finally, think about it. If someone from the village disappears, there will be an investigation. They'll eventually be traced back to us. Jean-Luc let go, exhausted, and began to pace the nave. It's not sensible on the cold flagstones. Not if we're careful, not if we choose the right people, and not if we know how to create the right circumstances. He stopped in front of a statue of Saint Sebastian riddled with arrows, and a cruel smile distorted his features. For example, this charming Jean Bonfoy, a lonely young woman who works nights at the inn and often returns home late by isolated paths. You're crazy, exclaimed Matthias. Everyone knows her. Her mother would die of worry. Her mother is a simple woman who trusts God's representative. If we explain to her that her daughter has been called to a special mission, that she has joined a convent in a distant region, she will eventually accept it. If she asks for news, if she wants to write to him, Jean-Luc gave a chilling laugh. We'll take care of the correspondence, of course. A letter from time to time explaining that Jean is happy in her new life, that she is praying for her mother. You've always had beautiful handwriting, Matthias. The younger brother sank onto a bench, overwhelmed by his brother's plans. Jean-Luc, I beg you, give up this idea. We have lived in peace for 15 years in this village. We have our loyal customers, our habits. Why risk everything? Because our mission demands it, Jean-Luc thundered, turning to him. Because the Lord has chosen us to accomplish his work. These people revere us. They trust us blindly. Isn't this a sign that they are destined to serve a greater purpose? He knelt in front of the hotel and raised his arms toward the crucifix that dominated the heart. Lord, he said, give me the strength to make my brother understand that our actions are sanctified by your divine will. These bodies we offer are only earthly envelopes. Their souls, purified by our ritual, rise to you more quickly than ordinary voices. Matthias watched this demonstration with a mixture of fascination and horror. He remembered the time when Jean-Luc was simply his big brother, the one who protected him from the other children at the Clermont-Ferrand orphanage. But the years had transformed his natural religious fervor into a malignant obsession, an unshakable conviction that he was the instrument of divine will. And technically, Jean-Luc continued, getting up, how would we proceed? I don't want to hear that. You will listen to me, Matthias, because you are my brother and my accomplice. We are bound by bonds stronger than blood. We are bound by our sacred mission. Jean-Luc began to describe his plan with terrifying precision. Jean Bonnefoy would be lured to the presbytery under a religious pretext, perhaps an offer to have her participate in a special ceremony, a private pilgrimage, or even a secret charity mission. Once isolated, she would suffer the same fate as Anton and all the others before him. And what about her mother? Matthias asked in a toneless voice. Marie Bonnefoy is a pious and gullible woman. We will explain to her that her daughter has received a divine calling, that she has been chosen to join a contemplative order in the mountains. We will show her a forged letter from the bishopric. We will even organize a farewell ceremony in honor of this vocation. The people of the village will be impressed, perhaps a little jealous that Jean has been so singled out. The plan was exquisitely perverse, exploiting the villagers' natural deference to religious authority and their ignorance of the outside world. In this isolated community where news traveled slowly and the church was the only source of education and information, the priest's words carried the weight of law. When, asked Matthias, resigning soon, let me first prepare the ground, create the right conditions. It must seem natural, willed by Providence. In the days that followed, Jean-Luc put his plan into action with diabolical subtlety. He began by visiting Marie in good faith, pretending to be concerned about her financial situation and her daughter's future. He mentioned with slight hesitation the possibility of Jean serving the church in a particular way, without being more specific, letting the imagination of the sea fill in the blanks. At the same time, he had numerous conversations with Jean herself, questioning her about her faith, her spiritual aspirations, her desire to devote herself entirely to the service of God. The young woman, flattered by the attention the respected Father Jean-Luc paid her, responding with touching sincerity to her questions. "You know, Jean," he said to her one evening after the service, while she was sweeping the nave, "I have the impression that the Lord has special plans for you. Your piety, your devotion to your mother, all of this doesn't go unnoticed." The young woman stopped sweeping and looked at him curiously. "What do you mean, Father?" "I can't speak openly about it yet, but know that exceptional opportunities sometimes present themselves to the purest souls, missions that only the chosen can accomplish." These mysterious words intrigued Jean, who didn't dare press the issue but often thought about them. Jean-Luc thus scattered his clues, psychologically preparing his future victim to accept a proposal, which under other circumstances would have seemed suspicious to him. One morning in mid-March, as the first signs of spring were beginning to peek through the snow, an unforeseen event disrupted the Rouvieres brothers' plans. Catherine Blanc, the innkeeper, knocked on the presbytery door with a concerned expression. "My father," she said when Matthias opened it, "I have received a letter concerning you." She held out a sealed envelope bearing the bishopric's coat of arms. "A traveler brought it this morning. He said it was urgent." Matthias took the letter with growing concern. It was rare for the bishoprics to come into direct contact with them, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Once Catherine had left, he joined Jean-Luc in his study and broke the red wax seal. His reading of the letter made him wonder. "What is it?" Jean-Luc asked. "We're going to have visitors. The VCH are sending an inspector, Father Francois Delorme, for a pastoral visit. He's due to arrive next week and stay for several days." Jean-Luc snatched the letter from his brother and quickly scanned it. His face hardened. "A routine inspection," he murmured. "They want to check our accounts, examine our records, meet with the parishioners, and if they discover anything, worry our activities." "He won't discover anything," replied Jean-Luc with an assurance he was far from feeling. "We'll clean everything, hide everything, and we'll give him such a warm reception that he'll leave convinced he's dealing with the two most exemplary priests in his diocese." And as for Jean-Luc reflected for a moment, weighing the risks. "We'll postpone for now, but as soon as this priest leaves, we'll take action. The opportunity might even be favorable. His departure would coincide perfectly with the sudden vocation of our dear Jean." The following days were devoted to meticulous preparation. The Rouvière brothers emptied their wine cellar of anything that might seem suspicious, burying their reserves in a secret vault dug under the crypt of the church. They meticulously cleaned all the compromising tools and utensils, burned some documents, and rehearsed their answers to potential questions. Jean-Luc also gave the villagers precise instructions, explaining that a church dignitary was coming to assess their community and that they had to make a good impression. He even organized a reception in honor of the Abbé de Elorme, with a banquet to which all the village notables would be invited. This would be an opportunity to demonstrate our excellent integration into the community, he explained to Matthias, and we could serve our latest specialties under the guise of traditional regional dishes. The following Wednesday, Abbé Francois de Delot arrived in St. Talbot in a carriage pulled by two horses, accompanied by a secretary and a servant. He was a man in his 50s, tall and slim, with an intelligent face, marked by years of study and responsibility. His piercing gray eyes seemed to let nothing escape him, and his courteous politeness concealed a natural authority that commanded respect. The Rouvieres brothers welcomed him with all the consideration due to his rank, with numerous bows and protestations of devotion. They showed him around the church and the presbytery, and introduced him to the leading members of the parish community. "Your church is remarkably well maintained," observed the priest, examining the stained glass windows and sculptures, "and your parishioners seem truly attached to their pastor." "We try to serve God and our community as best we can," replied Jean-Luc humbly. "Tell me about your charitable works. I understand that you often welcome the needy." "Indeed, Father, we cannot refuse hospitality to those in need. It is our Christian duty." The Abbé of Ohm nodded approvingly, but Matthias thought he detected a hint of special attention in his gaze. That evening, the banquet organized in the inspector's honor gathered around 30 guests in the great hall of the presbytery. Marie Bonnefoy and her daughter Jean had participated in the preparations, helping to set the tables and serve the dishes. The atmosphere was festive, and the villagers vied with each other to show their respectful regard for their prestigious elder. The meal was sumptuous for such a modest village. Vegetable soup, trout from the local river, pâtés en croûte, goat cheese, and above all, an extraordinarily tender roast that Jean-Luc presented as a specialty of their region. "This meat has a remarkable flavor," commented the Abbé of Elm after tasting it. "What exactly is it?" "A lamb raised according to traditional methods," replied Jean-Luc Sensler. "We feed it exclusively on wild herbs and selected grains. It's a family secret." "Indeed, the taste is unique," murmured the abbé, a strange expression crossing his face. He continued eating, but Matthias noticed that he chewed slowly, as if analyzing each bite. Several times during the meal, he asked seemingly innocuous questions about local suppliers, the region's culinary traditions, and the locals' eating habits. "Tell me," he asked Marie, "do you know the recipe for this delicious roast?" The baker shook her head, laughing. "Alas, no, Father, that's the secret of the Rouvieres pears. They are the only ones who know how to prepare this very special meat. We've often tried to get them to talk, but they remain as silent as carp." The abbot smiled politely, but his gaze focused on the two brothers for a long time. After the meal, while the guests dispersed into small groups of conversations, the abbot of the Elm approached Jean, who was discreetly clearing the tables. "Mademoiselle, in good faith, isn't it?" he said amiably. "Yes, Father," the young woman replied with a slight curtsy. "I understand that you work at the village inn." "That's right, Father. Since my father's death, I've been helping my mother and Madame Blanc. And so you see a lot of travelers indeed, although fewer in winter. But as soon as the roads become passable again, we regularly have passing customers." The abbot nodded thoughtfully. "Do all these travelers leave? I mean, don't some settle in the area?" Jean thought for a moment. "No, Father, they're usually just passing through." Although she hesitated, "What?" "Well, sometimes there are people who stop at our place and we never see them leave again. My boss says they must have found another route or left very early in the morning, but it's true, it's curious." The abbot kept his face neutral, but his eyes had become sharper. "Do you remember any recent examples? There was that young man in February, Antlin something. He came to eat at our house, and then Father Matthias invited him to the presbytery for the night. We never saw him again after that." "And that didn't intrigue you?" Jean shrugged with the innocence of her 22 years. "The priests told us he left very early before dawn. He gave her provisions and money to continue her journey to Toulouse. It was very charitable of them. Certainly, murmured the abbot, but his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The evening ended in good spirits, and the villagers returned home, proudly commenting on the success of the reception. The abbot of the elm retired to the state room that had been prepared for him, but he didn't sleep immediately. Sitting at his travel desk by candlelight, he wrote detailed notes on everything he had observed and heard. His long experience of pastoral visits had taught him to detect signs of malfunction, even the most subtle. And what he had just discovered in St. Talbin worried him deeply. First, the taste of the meat, which was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Then his accounts of travelers who mysteriously disappeared, and above all, the attitude of the Rouvieres brothers themselves, too attentive, too eager, with a look of the elder brother, a glimmer that he couldn't define, but which made him uncomfortable. He decided to extend his stay for a few days, claiming he wanted to deepen his knowledge of this exemplary community. In reality, he fully intended to conduct his own investigation into the mysterious secrets of Saint Talbin on the Imagnal. Father Francois de Elorme had spent a restless night, haunted by suspicions he couldn't clearly articulate. In the early morning he decided to get up early to observe the village before its inhabitants began their daily activities. From his bedroom window, he had a perfect view of the central square and the presbytery of the Rouvieres brothers. What he saw confirmed his nascent worries. Around 5:00 a.m. he saw Jean-Luc furtively leaving the presbytery, carrying a bag that seemed heavy. The priest headed towards the small cemetery adjoining the church and disappeared behind the graves, old ones. He reappeared 20 minutes later, empty-handed and his clothes soiled with fresh earth. Strange time to be gardening, the abbot murmured, taking note of the time and details of the scene. When Matthias came to officially wake him an hour later, the abbot of the elm was already dressed and ready for his second day of inspection. "I hope you slept well, Father," Matthias said with his usual smile. "Perfectly," Lab lied. "This room is very comfortable. I would like to relax today. Focus on your parish registers and accounts. This is the administrative part of my visit. Of course, Jean-Luc has prepared all the documents in his office." They found Jean-Luc carefully arranging papers on his desk. The abbot immediately noticed that the man seemed tense despite his efforts to appear relaxed. "These are our registers of baptisms, marriages, and burials for the past 5 years," Jean-Luc announced, pointing to several leather-bound volumes. The abbot of the elm carefully examined each document. The handwriting was neat, the accounts seemingly in order, but something bothered him about the accounting of provisions and food expenses. "You seem to consume significant quantities of meat," he observed. "This is unusual for a parish of this size. We receive many travelers," Jean-Luc explained. "Our duty of hospitality requires us to always have provisions in reserve." "Obviously. And where do you get your supplies?" "Which local butcher?" The two brothers exchanged a quick glance. "We buy our animals directly from local farmers," Matthias replied. "It's more economical and we can choose the quality, I see, and who handles the slaughtering and butchering." "We do it ourselves," Jean-Luc admitted after a moment's hesitation. "It's a skill we acquired out of necessity." L'Abbé nodded without comment but added this information to his mental notes. "Priests who personally slaughtered their animals. It was unusual to say the least. I'd like to see your reserves if you don't mind." "Unfortunately, our supplies are currently at their lowest," Matthias said in no hurry. "It's been a long winter and we've given a lot to the needy. That's to your credit. But I'd still like to take a look at your facilities." It was difficult to refuse without appearing suspicious. So Jean-Luc led the abbot to the cellar, which they had carefully cleaned a few days earlier. The place was indeed almost empty, containing only a few jars of preserved vegetables and barrels of wine. The elm abbot carefully examined the premises, noting the butcher's hooks attached to the beams, the traces of intensive cleaning on the walls, and above all, a lingering odor that he couldn't completely identify but which unpleasantly reminded him of the meat served the night before. "Very functional facility," he commented. "Those hooks seem to have been used a lot." "As I told you, we entertain a lot," Jean-Luc replied, his voice betraying a slight tension, coming back up from the stall. The abbot noticed a door he hadn't seen on his first visit. "Where does this door lead?" "The church's old crypts," explained Matthias. "We use them as a storage room for old liturgical objects. It's quite damp and awkward to access. I'd like to take a look if you don't mind. I'm interested in ancient sacred art." The two brothers couldn't decently refuse, so they went down into the crypts, Jean-Luc leading the way with a torch. The place was indeed damp and dark, with stone vaults disappearing into the darkness. The abbot of the elm tree followed attentively, all his senses on high alert. At the turn of a corridor, the torch's flame briefly illuminated chains attached to the wall. Jean-Luc quickened his pace, but the priest had already seen. "Chains?" he asked innocently. "A vestige of the Middle Ages," Jean-Luc replied without turning around. This crypt was sometimes used as an ecclesiastical prison for penitents. They quickly went back upstairs, but the priest of the elm was now certain that something very serious was going on in this seemingly exemplary parish. In the afternoon, he asked to meet individually with several parishioners, claiming to want to gather their testimonies on the quality of the pastoral service. In reality, he was seeking information on the mysterious disappearances mentioned by Jean Bonnefoy. His first visit was to Catherine Blanc, the innkeeper. He found her in her kitchen, busy preparing the evening meal. "Madame Blanc, I would like to speak to you about the travelers who frequent your establishment." "I'd be glad to, Father. What would you like to know?" "Have you noticed any irregularities in their comings and goings? People who disappear in unusual ways?" Catherine stopped stirring her pan and thought about it. "Now that you mention it, it's true that there are sometimes curious things. Customers who leave without paying or who leave their belongings in their rooms. For example, last month, there was this porter from Lyon, a charming man who sold ribbons and haberdashery. He had rented a room for 3 days, but after 2 days he had disappeared. His luggage was still there with all his merchandise. And what did you do?" "I asked Father Rouvière. They told me he had left very early in the morning after feeling unwell. They had offered to take care of his belongings and send them to his family." "Did you find that normal?" Catherine shrugged. "Fathers are so devoted, and it's none of my business. If they say so, it's settled." The abbot continued his discreet investigation by visiting other residents. Everywhere he heard similar stories, travelers who vanished into thin air after passing through the presbytery, always with the kind explanation of the Rouvière brothers to reassure potential witnesses. The most disturbing was the testimony of the blacksmith Pierre Charpentier, a pragmatic and observant man. "Father," he said, lowering his voice, "since you're asking for my frank opinion, I must say these disappearances worry me. In 15 years, I've seen about 40 travelers pass by who never left, and each time the fathers have a ready-made explanation. You've never tried to check. How do you expect me to check? And who would suspect men of God? And I confess that sometimes when I see the smoke coming from the presbytery chimney at odd hours and that particular smell coming from their house," he stops, realizing he's venturing into dangerous territory. "What a smell," the abbot insisted. A cooking smell, but not like the others, something stronger, more particular. When evening came, the abbot of the elm pretended to have a headache to avoid the communal meal and remained alone in his room. He now had enough evidence to be certain that a crime was being plotted in St. Talbot, but he needed concrete evidence. Around midnight, when the entire presbytery was asleep, he slipped silently out of his room. He now knew the area well enough to head towards the crypts without light. Fortunately, he had spotted in the afternoon where Jean-Luc was hiding the key. Armed with a small, dim lantern, he went back down into the church's underground passages. This time he was able to examine the premises at his leisure. What he discovered surpassed his worst suspicions. The chains attached to the wall bore recent traces of use. The floor was stained with what looked like dried blood. In a corner he found cutting and butchering tools, carefully stored but poorly cleaned, and in an alcove hidden behind a stained glass window, he made the most horrifying discovery of human ossements, carefully stacked. The elm bee had to lean against the wall to keep from fainting. He had just discovered the workshop of two cannibals, who operated under the cover of their religious function. But his investigation was not over. He methodically searched the crypts and finally found what he was looking for, a recently dug vault where jars containing pieces of meat in brine were stored. He had no doubt about the nature of this meat. Among the belongings piled in a chest, he found personal items that had belonged to the victims: jewelry, watches, letters, empty purses, and above all, a notebook in which Jean-Luc kept a gruesome account of their crime, with dates, names when he knew them, and details on the preparation of each victim. The priest went back up to his room with his evidence, his heart pounding and his stomach churning. He spent the rest of the night writing a detailed report, which he sealed and stamped with the bishop's letter. The next morning he informed Brother Rouvier that he had to cut short his visit due to an urgent fine. "I hope our parish has given you satisfaction?" Matthias asked anxiously. "Absolutely," replied the Barry with a forced smile. "You can be proud of your work." Jean-Luc scrutinized the inspector's face, trying to guess his thoughts. "You'll come back to see us, I hope." "Certainly," l'Abbé lied, "very soon, in fact." As he left, he discreetly slipped his report into the hands of Jean Bonfoy, who was helping load his luggage. "Mademoiselle, give this to the next policeman who passes by. It's very important. And above all, avoid being alone with the Rouviers until further notice." The young woman looked at him in comprehension, but something in the priest's serious tone convinced her to obey. The priest of the elm left St. Talbot with a sense of duty accomplished, but also with terrible anguish. He had discovered one of the most monstrous crimes of his career, but he knew that until the police arrived, the villagers remained in mortal danger in his car, which was driving away from the cursed village. He couldn't stop thinking about all those poor travelers, who had died in what should have been a refuge of peace and spirituality, and he prayed that his intervention had not come too late to save the future victims of the cannibalistic brothers of St. Talbot-sur-Elimignol. 3 days after the departure of Abbé de Elorme, the atmosphere in St. Talbot had returned to its usual tranquility. The Rouvier brothers, relieved to see this somewhat overly curious inspector leave, resumed their normal activities. Jean-Luc was convinced that they had succeeded in keeping the pretense, and he was eager to resume his plans for Jean in good faith. That morning, the young woman went to the presbytery to deliver the daily bread as she had done for years. And this time, she carried in her apron the letter Abbé de Elorme had entrusted to her, which she was to give to the next passing policeman. Matthias greeted her with his usual smile. But Jean noticed something different in his gaze, an intensity she'd never seen before. "My dear Jean," he said, taking the basket of bread, "my brother and I would like to speak to you about an important matter. Do you have a few minutes?" Of course, Father. What is it? It's delicate. Come in, we'll be better off inside to discuss things. Jean followed him into the living room where Jean-Luc was waiting for her, standing by the fireplace in his usual posture. But today, his gaze held an unsettling stare that immediately made the young woman uncomfortable. Jean-Luc began in his deep voice. You know how much we appreciate your dedication and piety. That's why we thought of you for a very special mission. A mission, Father. Yes, we have received, let's say, a divine communication concerning your spiritual future. It seems the Lord has special plans for you. Jean frowned, suddenly remembering the strange words of the abbot of the elm tree. I don't understand, Father. Matthias approached her, his smile becoming almost hypnotic. We have been contacted by a very ancient contemplative order hidden in the mountains. They are looking for pure young women to join their community. Your name has been submitted to them and they have accepted you, but I cannot leave my mother alone. Your mother will understand, Jean-Luc interjected. This is an extraordinary honor bestowed upon you. Few women receive such a calling, and if I refuse, the two brothers exchanged a glance. One does not refuse. A divine call, my dear child, said Jean-Luc. His voice took on a threatening note. Jean felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. Something in this conversation didn't add up, and the warnings of the elm tree's abbot came back to her. I must think about it, she said, backing toward the door and speaking to my mother. There's nothing to think about, Jean-Luc replied sharply, and your mother has no say in God's affairs. He advanced on her, blocking her retreat to the exit. Jean understood then that she was in mortal danger. Let me go, she cried, rushing to the window, but Matthias was faster. He grabbed her arm and yanked her back violently. In the struggle, the elm tree's letter fell from her apron and slid to the stone floor. Jean-Luc bent down to pick it up and broke the wax seal. Reading the letter made him blush with anger. What's this? Matthias asked, still grappling with the struggling Jean. That note, Abbé, he found out everything. He wrote a full report on our activities and gave it to that little bitch to give to the policeman. Jean-Luc furiously crumpled the letter and turned to Jean, his eyes shining with murderous fury. You were spying on us for that elm. I didn't know what was in that letter, Jean sobbed. He just asked me to give it to the police. The police spat Jean-Luc. How long before he arrives? I don't know. I haven't said anything to anyone else. I swear. Matthias looked at his brother with growing panic. What do we do? If the police come, they won't find anything, replied Jean-Luc, regaining his deadly calm. We're going to clean everything up, make everything disappear, and this little informer is going to help us. Isn't that right, Jean? He took a rope from his pocket and helped Matthias tie the young woman's hands behind her back. Despite her screams and pleas, they dragged her to the cellars of the presbytery. Meanwhile, in the village, Marie Bonaparte was beginning to worry. Her daughter hadn't returned from her morning delivery, which wasn't typical of her. She decided to go see what was going on at the presbytery. She knocked on the door, which opened to reveal Matthias's smiling face. But there was something forced about that smile that alarmed immediately. Hello. Marie, what can I do for you? I'm looking for Jean. She was just supposed to deliver the bread and come right back. Ah, Jean. Matthias exchanged a look with Jean-Luc, who had just appeared behind him. She did come to see us, but we had a long conversation. A very important conversation concerning her spiritual future, repeated Marie, perplexed. Come in, we'll explain everything to you, said Jean-Luc, stepping aside to let her pass. Once inside, the two brothers explained to Marie the story they had prepared, the divine call received by Jean, the invitation to join a contemplative order, the need to leave immediately so as not to miss this exceptional opportunity. But where is she? asked Marie, growing increasingly anxious. I want to speak to her. She's meditating, replied Jean-Luc. This revelation deeply troubled her, as you can imagine. She asked us for time to reflect and pray before seeing you. I can't believe she would make such a decision without speaking to me. First, Marie protested. Are the voices of the Lord impenetrable? Matthias murmured. Sometimes the divine call is so urgent that it leaves no time for earthly considerations. Marie wasn't entirely convinced, but the respect she felt for the two priests prevented her from insisting further. She finally agreed to go home and wait for news. As soon as she left, the Rouvière brothers sprang into action. They had to eliminate all evidence of their crime before the possible arrival of the gendarmes. Jean-Luc went down to the crypts to take care of Jean, while Matthias began burning all the compromising documents. In the damp underground passages, Jean was tied to the same chains that had served so many other victims before her. She wept silently, finally understanding the true nature of the two men she had venerated all her life. So, my dear Jean, said Jean-Luc, approaching her with a butcher's knife, did you really think you could have us arrested? I beg you, father, I won't say anything to anyone. I'll leave the village if you wish. Oh, you're going on a very long journey indeed. He raised his knife, but suddenly hurried footsteps echoed on the stairs. Matthias was running down. Jean-Luc, they're coming. I saw a squad of gendarmes on the road. They'll be here in half an hour. Jean-Luc swore violently. He no longer had time to execute Jean according to their usual ritual. Help me carry her to the secret room, he ordered. We'll finish it later when they've left. They dragged the unconscious young woman. Jean-Luc had knocked her unconscious with a blow from his knife handle to an alcove hidden behind a fake wall they had built years earlier for just such an emergency. Then they hurried back upstairs to complete their preparations. Matthias continued burning the documents while Jean-Luc lowered the last jars of supplies into the secret vault they had dug beneath the church building. 25 minutes later, a brigade of 6 gendarmes led by Sergeant Bertrand Lacroix entered the presbytery. He was an experienced man, a former soldier who had joined the gendarmerie, and not one to be impressed by cassocks. Fathers, he said without preamble, we have received information that crimes have been committed in this parish. We have come to conduct a search. Jean-Luc adopted his most indignant expression. Crimes, Marshal. Of a loggia, I don't know what you're talking about. We are men of God. That's precisely what we're going to check, replied the cross, signaling to his men to search the premises. The gendarmes were methodical and experienced. They weren't satisfied with the cursory inspection offered by the two brothers, but systematically searched every room, every corner, every piece of furniture. In the kitchen, Sergeant Morrow discovered poorly cleaned traces of blood on the worktop. In the pantry, despite intensive cleaning, the suspicious odor persisted and dark stains were still visible on the walls. What are these stains? The cross asked Jean-Luc. Wine, no doubt, the latter replied, but his voice trembled slightly. It's not wine, retorted Marshal de Loggia. I have enough experience in recognizing dried blood. The decisive discovery took place in the crypts. Despite the brothers' efforts to cover their tracks, the gendarmes found poorly concealed butchering tools, chains with traces of recent use, and above all, the secret sweat with human remains. Good God, murmured Brigadier Morrow, illuminating the macabre alcove with his lantern. There are at least 15 skeletons here. Meanwhile, another gendarme had discovered the secret vault beneath the hotel and the jars of meat stored there. Their rapid analysis of these provisions left no doubt as to their nature. Arrest them, ordered the cross, disgusted by his discovery. The Rouvieres brothers made no attempt to resist. Jean-Luc maintained his haughty and contemptuous air as if he were above his earthly contingencies. Matthias, on the other hand, was psychologically collapsing, finally realizing the horror of what he had participated in all these years. It was while continuing their search that the gendarmes discovered Jean Bonnefoy, unconscious but alive in her hiding place. She was immediately taken to the village doctor, who found her in shock but physically unharmed. When she was finally able to speak, her testimony further incriminated the two cannibal brothers. She recounted the blackmail attempts, the assault, and confirmed that the letter from the Abbé de Elorme contained evidence of their crime. The arrest of the Rouvière brothers caused deep trauma in the community of Saint-Aubin. The villagers could not believe that their revered pastor was in fact monsters who had killed and eaten dozens of innocent travelers. Marie Bonaparte nearly lost her mind when she learned that her daughter had almost suffered the same fate as all her victims. The other parishioners felt an overwhelming sense of guilt upon realizing that they had unknowingly participated in the cannibal feast organized by their priests. Catherine Blanc closed her in for weeks, unable to bear the thought that it was she who was directing travelers to their deaths. The blacksmith Pierre Charpentier blamed himself for not following up on his suspicions. The entire village was sinking into a collective guilt that would mark generations. Meanwhile, in the quays where they had been transferred, the two brothers awaited their trial. Jean-Luc persisted in his mystical delusions, claiming that his actions were sanctified by divine will, and that his judges would one day be punished for their sacrilege. Matthias, meanwhile, had sunk into a deep depression. He eventually confessed to their entire crime, giving precise details of each murder, each victim, and each plot. His testimony would help identify most of the victims and warn their families of the tragic fate of their missing loved ones. The investigation revealed that the Rouvière's brothers had murdered 43 people over 15 years, mainly isolated travelers, but also a few outcasts from surrounding villages. Their method was always the same, luring their victims with false promises of help, drugging them, and then taking them to the crypts where they would kill them according to a macabre ritual they claimed was religious. The meat was then butchered, prepared, and served at parish banquets, mixed with animal meat to mask the taste. The ossuaries were carefully preserved in the secret ossuary, and the victims' personal belongings were discreetly resold in distant villages. This revelation horrified all of France. Never before had the country experienced such a monstrous crime, all the more shocking because it was perpetrated by representatives of the church. The press seized on the case, and the mystery of the cannibalistic priests of Saint-Aubin made headlines in every newspaper in the country. The Catholic Church itself was deeply shaken by this scandal. The bishop was forced to issue a public apology and promise a complete reform of the surveillance system for isolated parishes. New procedures were put in place to prevent such a horror from happening again. The trial of the Rouvière's brothers opened on November 14 before the Assize Court of Azerbaijan. The case had taken on national proportions, and journalists from Paris, Lyon, and Marseille traveled to cover what was already being called the trial of the century. The courtroom, although vast, could not accommodate all those who wanted to attend the proceedings. Jean-Luc and Matthias Rouvière were brought to the dock under heavy escort, as the authorities feared crowd disturbances. Their appearances contrasted. Strikingly, Jean-Luc stood straight, his gaze fixed and contemptuous as if he were above this earthly procedure. Matthias, on the other hand, appeared broken, stooped, his face creased by months of remorse and anguish. The presiding judge, Maître Auguste Delmas, was an experienced man who had presided over numerous criminal trials, but never had he had to judge a case of such monstrosity. He opened the proceedings in a solemn voice that resonated in the deathly silence that reigned in the room. Jean-Luc and Mathias Rouvière, you appear before this court on 43 counts of premeditated murder and desecration of a grave. The charges against you are exceptionally serious and have stirred the emotion of the entire nation. The reading of the indictment lasted nearly 2 hours. Each victim was named when their identity could be established. Antoine Dubois, the young man from Clermont-Ferrand; Pierre Gallin, the peddler from Lyon; Marie Sauvet, a widow on her way to visit her sister in Toulouse; and so many others, most of them anonymous, whose existence was still only evidenced by a few personal belongings. When the witnesses took the stand, the emotion reached its peak. Jean Bonifoy, a dignified and distinguished woman, recounted her kidnapping and what she had discovered about the two brothers' true activities. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the chains in the crypts and the horrible realization of what awaited her. "I understood then," she said, looking at the accused, "that all these travelers who disappeared never left Saint-Talbin. They ended up on our plates." A murmur of horror ran through the audience. Several women left the room, unable to bear his revelations. Father Francois de Elorme then testified about his discovery and his investigation. He explained how seemingly trivial details, the unusual taste of the meat, the testimonies about the disappearances, and the suspicious attitude of the accused had put him on the trail of the truth. "At first, I refused to believe my own suspicions," he confessed. "How could you imagine that men dedicated to God could commit such acts?" But the ordeal mounted, and I could no longer turn a blind eye. The most damning testimony came from Matthias himself. Unlike his brother, who maintained a contemptuous silence, he had chosen to confess everything, perhaps in the hope of obtaining some form of redemption. "It all started 15 years ago," he recounted, his voice breaking. "A traveler had died of illness in our presbytery. Jean-Luc said it would be a waste to bury him like that. He said God was offering us this food, and that we should accept it with gratitude." The audience held their breath, horrified by his revelations. "At first, I didn't want to, but Jean-Luc was so convincing. He said it was a form of mystical communion, that we purify these souls by absorbing them into our consecrated flesh. And then the first time we served it to the parishioners, they enjoyed it so much. They said they had never eaten anything so delicious." And after that first time, the prosecutor asked. "Afterward, Jean-Luc said we had to continue, that God was sending us these souls to purify. When the travelers became rare, we began to look at the villagers differently." He looked up at Jean in good faith, sitting in the witness box. "Forgive me, Jean, forgive us all. We had become monsters." Jean-Luc stood up abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "Shut up, Matthias, you don't understand anything. We were the chosen ones, we were carrying out divine work. These people who judge us are not worthy of silence," you immediately thundered. But Jean-Luc continued his mystical diatribe, asserting that their actions were sanctified by divine will, and that the judgment of men did not affect him. It took the intervention of several gendarmes to make him sit down and silence him. The defense attorney, Maître Dumont, had an impossible task: how to defend the indefensible. He tried to plead insanity, evoking a religious delusion that would have impaired the defendant's discernment. But the testimonies had shown too much premeditation, too much methodical calculation, for this line of defense to be credible. The prosecutor's closing argument was relentless. He demonstrated, point by point, the monstrosity of the crimes committed, the systematic breach of trust, the desecration of religious functions. He demanded the death penalty for both defendants. "Gentlemen of the jury," he concluded, "these men have forever sullied the memory of their victims and traumatized an entire community. They used their sacred position to lure their prey and literally devour them. There is no punishment severe enough for such a crime. The jury retired to deliberate. The proceedings had lasted 4 days, and emotion was running high in the courtroom and throughout the country which was following the case. France had never seen a trial of such media coverage. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jurors returned with their verdict. There was complete silence when the jury president stood up to read it. When asked, Jean-Luc Rowe is Uvier guilty of premeditated murder against Anton Dubois, Pierre Gallon, and Marie Sauvet. The list of 43 victims was enumerated one by one. The court replied, yes, unanimously. The same verdict was handed down for Matthias Rouvier. Both were found guilty of 43 premeditated murders. The penalty was automatic, death. Jean-Luc greeted the verdict with a loving laugh, continuing to proclaim that he was a martyr and that his judges would be punished by divine wrath. Matthias completely collapsed, sobbing and asking forgiveness from all the families of the victims present in the courtroom. The execution was scheduled for December 18 in the public square of Mende, but contrary to custom, it did not take place amid the popular jubilation usual to this kind of event. The horror of the crimes had created a particular atmosphere, one of thirst, justice, and profound disgust. Thousands of people had traveled from all over the region, and even further afield to witness the execution of the cannibal priests. Barriers had been set up to contain the crowd, and a heavy security presence was deployed. Jean-Luc ascended the scaffold, continuing his mystical imprecations. He refused the assistance of the priest who offered him the last rites, claiming that he himself was closer to God than any representative of the church. You kill a saint, he shouted to the crowd, but my death will be avenged. The Lord will punish the wicked. He had to be bayoneted to prevent him from continuing his ranting. He was hanged first, struggling to the end with a fanatical energy that impressed even the experienced executioner. Matthias, on the other hand, was resigned. He had spent his last weeks in prison writing letters of repentance to the victims' families and confessing every detail of their crimes to help investigators. He ascended the scaffold with his head bowed, murmuring sincere prayers. "Forgive me," he said simply before the rope tightened around his neck. His death was quicker and less agitated than his brother's. The crowd greeted both executions in a heavy silence, without the usual cries of joy. The horror of the affair outweighed the sense of justice served. After the execution, the authorities completely razed the St. Alban Presbytery and permanently walled up the church crypts. A new priest was appointed, but it took months for him to find parishioners willing to return to Mass. Jean Bonnefoy never fully recovered from her trauma. She left St. Alban a few months after the trial to move in with an aunt in Lyon, where she lived anonymously until her death in 1889. She never married and never spoke publicly about the affair again. Marie Bonnefoy closed her bakery and died of grief less than a year after the events. Catherine Blanc sold her inn and moved to Ardèche. Many of St. Alban's residents emigrated, unable to bear the weight of this cursed memory. The village itself never fully recovered. For decades, people avoided passing through St. Alban, and the rare travelers who ventured there were met with suspicion. The Rouviers brothers' affair had forever shattered the innocent trust of this rural community. The Catholic Church learned lessons from this tragedy by implementing a stricter system of supervision for isolated parishes. New rules were established regarding the appointment of priests, their training, and above all, their regular monitoring by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Laws were also passed regarding the mandatory registration of travelers at all inns, and the systematic reporting of disappearances to civil authorities. The feudal system of isolating rural communities began to evolve toward greater transparency and state control. The Rouviers brothers' affair thus marked a turning point in the judicial and social history of France. It revealed the dangers of blind authority and communal isolation, while raising profound questions about human nature and the possible excesses even among those who are supposed to embody moral good. Even today, in Saint-Aubin-sur-Limignan, some elderly residents remember the stories their grandparents told them about these terrible events. The old rectory was never rebuilt, and its site remains empty, like a scar on the village landscape. A discreet plaque commemorates the 43 victims of the Cannibal brothers, without mentioning the details of their crime. For while human justice was expressed by hanging the culprits, collective memory chose a punishment perhaps even harsher: voluntary forgetting and silence. Saint-Aubin-sur-Limignan had preferred to bury this dark page of its history rather than risk perpetuating the horror through commemoration. Thus ends the terrible story of the Cannibal Priests of Saint-Aubin-sur-Limignan. An episode that reminds us that the greatest monsters can sometimes hide behind the most respectable masks, and that civic vigilance is always necessary in the face of abuses of power, even when it disguises itself as virtue. The legacy of this affair extends far beyond the borders of the small Lossay commune. It remains one of the most significant crimes of 19th-century France, and continues to inspire criminologists and historians who question the psychological and social mechanisms that can lead seemingly normal individuals to such abominations. Perhaps the main lesson of this tragedy remains that blind trust, even in the most respected authority figures, can become dangerous when accompanied by isolation and a lack of external controls. The 43 victims of the Rouviers brothers paid with their lives for this lesson, a lesson that history should never have needed to teach. Mr.